So my name is Louis-Philippe, and I'm the winner of the contest Be François Tanguay-Renaud for one day. And I'm about halfway through that day, so it's a very exciting time in my life. So I'll be chairing the session today. So this is part of the, I should say officially, the Nathanson Centre on Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security lecture series. And our guest today is Detlef von Daniels, who is a lecturer at Witten Herdecke University in Germany. Detlef received his MA from the University of Freiburg and a PhD from the University of Göttingen. And his main areas of teaching and research are legal philosophy, political philosophy, and the history of ideas. He has a book on the concept of law from a transnational perspective, which is published by Ashgate. And the book deals with how current changes in the course of globalization can be integrated into legal theory. And he's working on another book on the idea of the Commonwealth as a post-statal political theory. So today, Detlef will be talking to us about how Plato silenced the Cosmopolitans. The format will be the usual format for this series. So we'll have about a 35-minute presentation, and then Professor Michael Giudice from our philosophy department at York will offer a 10-minute or so response, and then we'll open the floor for questions. And when you ask questions, I'll ask you to use the microphones, because François really cares about that, and I'm acting on behalf of François. So I'll enforce that. So,
yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and of course, thanks for the invitation by Michael, which is very nice. We already had a nice discussion over lunch on a few topics. And today I will present something of my current research. So the title is actually, it changed slightly. It's how Plato overcame the Cosmopolitans. It has a motto in the paper I sent around. The motto is one you will all know. It is, I will just read it. The motto is, it's just a jump to the left and then a step to the right. With a bit of a mind flip, you are there in the time slip, and nothing can ever be the same. So I wouldn't want to sing or dance the motto, but I think you know it. So the idea is that Plato's philosophy is in a way following this advice. First, so to say, overtaking the Cosmopolitans on the left, then stepping suddenly to the very right, and with a twist of the pelvis and at the same time a little time slip, changing everything. Or I will just leave it a bit to your imagination to draw the connections and start with my thesis. In the paper, I voice a certain uneasiness with regard to the contemporary discussion on cosmopolitanism. On the one hand, it appears to be the logical end of liberal political philosophy, yet on the other hand, its foundations may not be as solid as presumed. I would like to spell out this worry by reflecting the current state of affairs in ancient times. My thesis is that the beginning of philosophy was marked by very similar pragmatic cosmopolitan sentiments, and that Plato, while establishing philosophy as a specific kind of inquiry, became in effect the first anti-cosmopolitan philosopher. Since I assume you're all familiar with the current discussion on cosmopolitanism, I will just briefly point out three characteristics of the discourse. In contemporary texts on cosmopolitanism, one often reads that it has a long history starting with the Stoics over Kant up to the present time. However, one seldom reads that in between it was practically dead. To name but one example, the 1964 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica doesn't even have an entry on cosmopolitanism and refers under international relations only to related articles such as on empire, spheres of influence, etc. In official Marxist terminology, on the other hand, cosmopolitanism was considered to be, in any case, a camouflage strategy of US imperialism. Thus, the relation between philosophical theory and real history is more complicated than the weak history of cosmopolitanism assumes. And philosophy, or the philosophical zeitgeist, is more complex and does not only consist of liberal political philosophy. That is the first characteristic, which is an external or sociological one. However, most cosmopolitans will arguably dismiss it quickly as irrelevant or misguided, and insist on discussion of the features they consider to be central. Since Thomas Pogge's definition has become famous, I use it in the paper. I will spare you the details on distinctions between various forms of cosmopolitanism. Instead, I will make again two observations. The first is that all people involved in the discussion take equality to be the central value of political philosophy. Most explicitly, Will Kimlicka claims that, quote, every plausible political theory has the same ultimate source, which is equality, end of quote, and at one point remarks that we would not even talk to someone who would not accept this premise, but turn our back on him. This advice is obviously not very helpful for discussing Plato. This premise is becoming even more questionable when realizing that there is a detailed debate about the equality of what question, but hardly any debate on the question, why equality in the first place? If it is not hidden in a requirement of reasonableness, it is usually just presumed. For instance, explicitly stated by Brian Berry, who writes, quote, equality is a rock-bottom ethical premise that cannot be derived from anything else, end of quote. As long as the aim is to defend a certain conception of equality within a society that considers itself to be liberal, the more interesting debate is indeed explicating what it means to treat citizens as equal, so the equality of what question. However, in cosmopolitan debates, egalitarianism becomes more prominent as a premise, since cosmopolitan theories aim at being not only acceptable by liberal societies, but also others, for instance, called decent societies or by collectivist moralities. There may, however, be a reason why this premise cannot be or need not be explicitly defended, which leads to the third characteristic of contemporary cosmopolitanism. One might think that all non-egalitarian theories depend on some metaphysical views that cannot be defended within the limits of reasonable empiricism. Pogge alludes to this argument by presuming that all approaches that do not share the values of cosmopolitanism must presume a metaphysical view of arbitrary differences, such as between men and women, commoners and aristocrats, blacks and whites, compatriots and others. Contemporary cosmopolitanism, on the other hand, is characterized by taking a strict anti-metaphysical attitude. In any case, the theory is presented as to be based on very lean, easily to accept premises for which non-metaphysical may be the label. These are three broad characteristics of a debate you are all familiar with. However, I do not plan to discuss certain arguments of this debate, but instead turn to the second part of the lecture, to the historical mind flip and the time slip, so that nothing can ever be the same. I suggest that historical reflection may not only provide us with more details about our tradition, but may also serve to call us, that is, our contemporary debate, into question. In particular, I will argue, Plato was the first anti-cosmopolitan philosopher who reacted against cosmopolitan philosophers of his time. This thesis may appear to be a historical uphill battle, as according to the official genealogy of cosmopolitanism, it was only developed by Diogenes in the 3rd century BC. So I need to show that the idea of cosmopolitanism predates its formulation. To this end, I mainly rely on two contemporaries of Plato, namely Isocrates and Xenophon, who express ideas that can be reassembled to something that is very similar to contemporary cosmopolitanism. Isocrates was, in the 4th century, the head of the most famous school in Athens. He claims to have had, quote, more pupils than all the rest together who are occupied with philosophy, end of quote. So he was really the one who made public opinion in Athens at Plato's lifetime. In his speeches, Isocrates clearly analyzes the perils the Greek world faced in the 4th century. Constant civil strife, both within cities, often fueled by third-party interests, as well as between cities and coalitions, threatened to destroy prosperity, peace and culture of the Greek Commonwealth. As an alternative, Isocrates proposed to form a confederation of free and autarkic cities, a brotherhood of culture, transcending the bonds of race. He argued that peace, not only among Greeks, but with all of mankind, would be the precondition for striving for true aims, and true aims being aims such as being respected by others and raising the standards of living for all. He criticizes realist principles of power politics for being unjust and serving only short-term interests. In the long run, it would be in everyone's interest to uphold peace, end the suffering among Hellenic people, and support burdened societies. These are refugees from destroyed cities. Isocrates also criticizes the common enemies of mankind. These are the mercenaries who commit atrocities that make peace impossible. Simple, solid political judgment based on a fair assessment of facts should convince Athenians and everyone else to pursue this cause. Thus, the idea of a peaceful federation among free and autarkic cities was well known in Athens and the intellectual circles of the ancient world. From a philosophical point of view, Xenophon did not contribute much. He did, however, present historical details on development in Greece that could be used to speculate about a federal future of Greece. In addition, Xenophon is important as he voices a strict anti-metaphysical view put in the mouth of Socrates. Thus, Xenophon's Socrates says, quote, "I don't know nothing that is not good for anything, and I do not wish to know it either," end of quote. Instead, Xenophon's Socrates gives well-reasoned political advices just like slightly conservative modern-day political philosophers would do. It is more difficult to ascertain philosophical principles underlying this form of cosmopolitanism. In the paper, I discuss whether it is possible to read the sophists as early liberal philosophers in the way Karl Popper did. My answer is a yes, but. Popper's representation of the sophist as swindlers and real corruptors of the youth is obviously one-sided. However, simply reversing the value judgment, like Popper does, doesn't do justice to the movement either. What can be said is that the sophists questioned traditional authority, promoted education instead of noble origin, and appeared in Athens at a time when egalitarian and democratic principles were widely held. Thus, all of them shared the optimistic belief that success is based on individual effort and can be taught. At least some of them defended the political principles Athens was based on, namely legal and political egalitarianism, equal right to address the assembly and bring charges, equal representation in government by lot, and freedom of speech. I've painted the ancient cosmopolitanism in broad strokes in order to show what kind of theorizing Plato faced. Strangely enough, it very much reminds of contemporary cosmopolitanism. The question is thus, how is it possible that ideas and principles that appear nowadays to be self-evident and characteristic of our time predate the formation of philosophy as an academic discipline in Plato and Aristotle? And why has political philosophy in the tradition of Plato apparently ignored all these cosmopolitan roots? As a first approach to answer the question, I point out that it is not a new question. Indeed, it is a question that emerged right with the beginning of academic philosophy around Plato's lifetime. Even though there is no source where the question is posed in this way, we find an answer to this question in the letters handed down under Plato's name. When reading not just the seventh letter, but all letters together, like a novel of letters, a specific picture of Plato emerges. The subtext of the letters is that Plato is the spiritual center of a wide-ranging intellectual community that tries, through practical advices, to foster the Pan-Hellenic cause, both as an intellectual and as a well-reasoned military and political alliance. Thus, his overall aim for his engagement in Syracuse was establishing peace in all of Sicily by striking a compromise between various factions based on the rule of law, stressing equality of all, aiming at securing Greek freedom and benefiting all people. However, the letters where this idea is most obvious are the one most scholars consider to be not genuine. Nevertheless, they are telling, as they were written around Plato's lifetime, arguably in the context of the academy, thus from people who supported or thought to support Plato's cause. Thus, even people at Plato's lifetime thought that is what he should have written. Constant civil strife is destroying our civilization, and pan-Hellenic cosmopolitanism, and possibly peace with Persia, is the obvious solution. But it is not what Plato actually did write in his philosophical dialogues. On the contrary, the sophistic tradition I have previously exposed, which appears like a mirror image of contemporary cosmopolitanism, is precisely what Plato was opposed to. We thus have to face a renversement des alliances. Political philosophy, the tradition that has started with Plato, is not a natural friend of contemporary cosmopolitanism, but may indeed turn out to be its arch-enemy. In a more detailed interpretation of the Politeia, I will now show how Plato managed to silence these cosmopolitan voices, namely by inventing philosophy as a dialectic endeavor. Thus, I will propose to read the Platonic dialogues as a conscious interventions in the discussions of his time. In the paper, I offered a detailed reading of several passages. Here I will just sketch the general line. First, I show how Plato plays with the expectations of his audience. It starts with the first set of arguments. Cephalus has the first say, representing the traditional view. It is to be noted that the tradition, especially in Piraeus, was the democratic tradition. Yet, instead of giving a speech like Pericles, Cephalus talks about sex life in old age and his personal salvation. Thus, Plato's first move is to irritate the cosmopolitan reader by introducing the representative of the traditional democratic elite of Piraeus and letting him ask a question that shatters the self-assurance of the traditional way of life. The question Cephalus asks is important for a systematic reason. It shows the dimension of question after justice that needs to be tackled in some way. If the question were limited from the outset to the political domain, Cephalus' questions, so to say, what's in it for me, for my soul, would still be looming in the background and might justify withdrawing from the discussion altogether. That is, however, just the start. Over the course of the argument in Book 1 and 2, Plato presents three different views regarding justice. First, justice means saying the truth and giving back what is due, Cephalus and Polemarchus. Second, justice is a convention out of fear, that's Glaukon as an advocatus diaboli. And third, justice is what serves the stronger, Thrasymachos. I cannot repeat the argument in all its intriguing details. Instead, I would like to single out two aspects. First, all of the principles presented could also govern relations between various poleis, and indeed both Thrasymachus and Socrates use examples that show that they have the interpolis dimension in mind. Thus, at this stage, interpolis relations are not a special case, so to say, only to be discussed in a second step, like in the social contract tradition, after justice is established in the polis, but rather a part of the broad range of examples one is talking about. The second aspect I would like to single out is the nature of the discussion demonstrated in Book 1 and the beginning of Book 2. One might think that Plato is setting the different sophistic theories of justice short, that somehow principles such as truthfulness and reciprocity mentioned by Cephalus must feature in a definition of justice, or that a social contract tradition named by Glaukon is a useful explanatory or justificatory device, and finally that Plato ostensibly appears to be turning a blind eye to the central quality of justice, namely equality. It is certainly possible to pursue any of these lines. The way Plato presents the discussion, though, shows that he has something different in mind. At the end of the discussion with Thrasymachos, Socrates declares that no conclusion has been reached, and moreover, that no positive conclusion could ever be reached in this way. this confession by Socrates should be taken seriously. The innovative idea or milestones achieved by the Politeia is precisely to show that all sophistic discussions, even those by Socrates, are operatic, and that real inquiry, which later turns out to be philosophy, consists of something else. However, even though the cosmopolitan position is insufficient, it is necessary as a beginning, and for this reason implicitly presumed until Book 4. When Socrates talks about the foundation of a city, he does not start with the idea of a society, let alone the idea of a society of free and equals, nor does he presume the polis as the natural aim of man. Instead, he argues it is more convenient for people if each one specializes in what he does best. Thus, a loner who lives completely on his own would have a difficult life, but it is not ruled out. Plato then shows that the various professions emerge from the needs people have for each other. The city of bare necessity, or the healthy city that evolves in this way, is often quickly dismissed in discussions of Plato to focus exclusively over the intermediate step of the feverish city on the complete city. I argue instead that the first two models of the city are important, even with respect to the two subsequent ideal models, the guardian city and the philosopher's city. Both the healthy city and the feverish city can be read as implicit responses to cosmopolitan pretensions. The model of the healthy city would even be, to use an anachronistic idea, universalizable. If all peoples on earth lived the healthy lifestyle prescribed by Socrates for people living in the healthy city and complied with some form of traditional ethics, including provisions for hospitality, the main causes of war, poverty and large-scale migration would be absent. This model vaguely recalls Rawls' society of liberal peoples who all practice justice but never go to war. We know that liberal peoples would never do this, going to war. The difference is that in Plato's healthy stadium of mankind, political institutions seem to be absent. In any case, Plato's spokesman Socrates doesn't say that this kind of life is impossible. It is Glaucon who denounces this life as a city of souls, as one may translate loosely, or as one may translate loosely, these are rules for keeping livestock of the humankind. Nowadays, we would probably formulate these rules with the help of the Human Development Index. The interesting point is that the development of the healthy city into the feverish city is not just a history of decay, but at the same time a materialistic theory of development of philosophy. The problem about the healthy city of souls is that justice and injustice is not seen, quote, unless it's somewhere in some needs these men have of one another, end of quote. Justice is happening behind these people's backs, so to say, but its principle is not obvious to them. For this reason, there can be no philosophy in this place, and it's arguably for this reason that Socrates gives in so quickly to Glaucon's demand, instead of trying to teach him, as Xenophon's Socrates would do, to have only reasonable desires. Thus, in a way, even the philosopher would have an interest in the evolution of the healthy city into the feverish city, because only after this change do the social conditions of justice become institutionalized in such a way as to become discernible. The feverish city is also not merely an intermediate step, but also expresses one variety of cosmopolitanism, which becomes the constant counterfoil for the rest of the dialogue. It is not out of evil intentions, but out of practical necessity that the feverish city practices something we might call economic cosmopolitanism. This form of cosmopolitanism is easily paired with an imperialistic strategy. One may object that imperialistic cosmopolitanism is a contradiction in terms, as every variety of cosmopolitanism is opposed to aggressive wars or violent takeover. However, in these short passages, Plato is presenting again a materialistic theory of the development of societies. Presumably, the feverish city will not regard itself as imperialistic, but will sail under false colors. For instance, like Rome, think of itself as a republic with nothing more in mind than the moral improvement of the world. It is to be noted that Plato explicitly reserves the term polis in the true sense to the purified city of warriors. Thus, the construction of the ideal polis can truly be seen as a response to two kinds of cosmopolitan pretensions. At this point, one might still think that exploiting possible cosmopolitan consequences of Plato's presentation is a far-fetched argument, and that in presenting his ideal of the closed city, Plato did not overcome the cosmopolitans, but simply ignored them. In any case, it is necessary to face Plato's construction of the ideal city, including its totalitarian aspects. So, what do we make out of it? The first point to note is that Plato's ideal city, Callipolis, really is weird, not only for the modern-day reader, but also for the contemporary ones. So the question is, if Plato's aim was to propose an oligarchic constitution as an ideal, then why did he present his claims in this way? And what is the source of his confidence that there is nothing a sophist could possibly say against it? We initially find the answer to the basis for Plato's confidence in the form of an assertion. Unlike the sophist, the philosopher is defined as the one who can distinguish between mere opinion and true knowledge. Thus, Plato is confident that he is the first person to practice philosophy as Wissenschaft, that is, as to seek knowledge in a comprehensive and systematic way, including the natural and the human science. For this reason, I use the German term Wissenschaft. Yet, providing a specific definition of philosophy does not prove that such a thing really exists. Anyone could make the same claim, including the sophists, and state that their view is Wissenschaft as well. It is particularly instructive to realize that Plato concedes this point. Not only that such a dispute exists, but also that philosophy as Wissenschaft has no conclusive means to stop this discussion. After refuting the sophists and after developing the analogy of city and soul, Socrates still concedes that the many will be unable to distinguish the true philosopher from false sophists. On the contrary, the many will falsely blame philosophers for pupils who turn out badly. At this very point, Plato also explains that even the very best philosophical nature can go astray by trying to mind the business of, quote, both Hellenes and barbarians, end of quote. Thus, Plato explicitly introduces a cosmopolitan opponent, even granting he might have a good philosophical nature, but insisting that, like all the sophists, he is fundamentally mistaken. Plato's claim is that philosophy is a fundamentally different kind of endeavor. Therefore, what Plato develops is not an anti-cosmopolitan theory. This would presume that there are two kinds of theory, one cosmopolitan and one anti-cosmopolitan, and that both can argue for their claims on an even playing field. Plato is taking the discussion beyond the stage. So he is not anti-cosmopolitan, but so to say, uber-cosmopolitan, so cosmopolitan beyond cosmopolitanism. But how can this position be achieved? Plato shows that the way into uber-cosmopolitan philosophy is in the form of a simple question, namely, after justice has been introduced and explained, asking, but is it really good? This question sounds simple, but in fact it is very powerful, for it requires digging into the foundation of one's own theory. Philosophy must explain its own relationship to its time and surrounding world in such a way as to let us understand ourselves and others in a more comprehensive, Plato could say, dialectical way. What Plato is doing in the famous allegories of the lion, the sun, and the cave is foremost not introducing a positive theory of metaphysics as a foundation. Instead, Plato presents his theory in this way because he wants to demonstrate that above all, philosophy is something that has to be practiced among like-minded people. So, quote, only the dialectical way of inquiry proceeds in this direction, destroying the hypothesis, to the beginning itself in order to make it secure, and when the eye of the soul is really buried in a barbaric bog, dialectic gently draws it forth and leads it up above, using the arts we described as assistants and helpers in the turning around. End of quote. It is important to realize that philosophy as a dialectic endeavor starts only after the ideal of the city has been presented. The question after the good is, however, not the only way into philosophy. Plato names various other approaches, for instance, arithmetic. Thus, he has something like a systematic unity of the various sciences in mind. In each case, the question after the agathon, the highest good, is leading the way. Yet this kind of questioning also reveals the limits of Plato's philosophy, which takes me to the final part of my presentation. The first limit is that the nature of the highest good remains a mystery. In the Politeia, Socrates remarks incidentally, quote, "Let's leave aside for the time being what the good itself is," end of quote. And in the seventh letter, Plato states explicitly, quote, "There neither is nor ever will be a treatise of mine on this subject," end of quote. Given our reading up to this point, Plato's confession may seem particularly disappointing. He has omitted a more detailed institutional exposition of the best city and a defense against rival theories by suggesting a deeper foundation, and now the deeper foundation has turned out to be elusive. In terms of real-world politics, concentration on one mythical founding figure, together with the establishment of an institution to guarantee the authenticity of interpretation, could easily be translated in a claim for leadership of the Platonic Academy. Real insight can only be found there and requires secret initiation. However, due to the lack of direct evidence, especially any evidence from Plato himself, the characterization of the Platonic Academy is a matter of speculation. Instead, a different question can be raised. Why didn't Plato develop his own uber-cosmopolitan theory, including a metaphysical basis, and explained how it related to the Hellenic world? His openness to influences from other cultures, his awareness of cultural relativity, and even the dialectical method all seem to point in this direction. One answer is given by Plato himself. He constantly stresses that only the few would be able to grasp the idea of philosophy. This assumption in itself may result in an oligarchic view, but it would not preclude developing a pan-Hellenic or cosmopolitan perspective, perhaps by elevating Athens as the leader of the free world. However, in Plato, the oligarchic view is sustained by a tragic idea of history. It is best captured in his allegory of the two ages introduced in the Statesman. The allegory depicts Plato's tragic view of the trajectory of the world. It is not just that some people or political regimes are unjust, or some practices should be reformed. It is the trajectory of the world that is wrong. Only if someone with a godlike soul assumed total power over some people and reversed the entire order of things, might it be possible to save the world by setting an example. This premise is the first limit of Plato's philosophy. The second limit becomes obvious when reflecting again on the figure of Socrates. For the way Plato brought philosophy to the world, it is not an unhappy fact that Socrates was already dead at the time, but a necessary precondition. Even as Plato wrote his dialogues, no one could ask the historical Socrates, "What do you think about this?" or "Plato wrote this, do you agree with it?" Thus, the Platonic pathway to philosophical education never allows for competing opinions of equal standing. Moreover, real insights are often postponed, withheld, or, as by Socrates in the Symposium, uttered in someone else's name. The idea seems to be that real insight can only be found through Socrates or the Academy and requires secret initiation. This evasive reference to an undefined center is a feature of Plato's philosophy that has consequences for its reception. One could say that just as there can be only one initiated philosophical practice, there can be only one Callipolis. This point is stressed as Plato always uses Socrates as an indispensable intermediary for finding the way through the intricate practice of philosophy, but he never explains how the man Socrates could arise in the first place. If everyone needs guidance from the initiated, there needs to be the first initiator, someone who initiated himself or who gained insight out of himself. So we might ask how the Athenian citizen Socrates could ever become the philosopher Socrates, and why self-recognition should be confined to the case of Socrates, who then must serve as a medium for everyone else. However, in Plato, the paideia, the philosophical formation of body and soul, is limited to the teacher-pupil relationship and never happens between two persons of equal standing who are both philosophers in the best sense. This has also important political consequences. While Plato lionizes the figure of Socrates, he demonstrates at the same time a strange disregard of ordinary human beings. For the most part, they are referred to as sheep, dogs, or puppets that need to be formed. Similarly, other cities appear as external threats or resources for practical studies, but never as possible philosophical sites in their own right. Thus, one could say that the internal limit that precludes Plato from developing the idea of a Hellenic commonwealth of independent cities is a philosophical limit. Plato has expressed philosophy by dramatizing the person of Socrates, thus demonstrating a particular form of philosophical practice, but he failed to develop the underlying principle that might allow us to conceptualize the relationship between different individuals as subjects or between different autonomous cities in a commonwealth. Let me try to sum up. I began this essay by suggesting that current liberal convictions that appear to lead naturally to a cosmopolitan theory or a theory of global justice are not as firmly grounded as one might think, and that ancient thought might serve as a mirror of current discourse. The challenge I want to present in this way, challenge understood both as a provocation and trial, is that the fronts have turned around. The ancient philosophical tradition does not merely represent a pre-cosmopolitan junior state, but instead turns out to be the trap of ancient cosmopolitan sentiments. Obviously, I have not tried to give answers to contemporary problems, let alone give normative recommendations about how to build a just world, but merely attempted to explore the dimension of the question of a cosmopolitan order. Or, to vary Plato's image, I have illuminated the cave we are living in a different light, so that the desire to leave it may arise. Yeah, thank you for the attention. You may now leave the cave.
Thank you. I like it.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Professor Von Daniels for offering a rich reading of Plato. And it's, of course, always fascinating to go back and look at one of the founders of philosophy and see if the old adage is true that it's all just footnotes to Plato. Now, his reading of Plato offers a particular emphasis on the style and strategy of presentation of Plato's ideas, and in particular how these relate to the nature and origin of philosophy itself. Now, the view of philosophy which emerges is, I think, relatively familiar. Philosophy is a lived practice or commitment to questioning assumptions, disrupting common ideas, and shaking popular, typically unreflective beliefs, all with the aim of clearing the way for a better, more enlightened understanding. This view reminds me of a nice statement, perhaps my favorite statement, of the purpose of philosophy offered by Isaiah Berlin roughly 40 years ago. Berlin writes that, to quote, "The task of philosophy Often a difficult and painful one is to extricate and bring to light the categories and models in terms of which human beings think. Looking back to the ancient Greeks with Professor von Daniels, we can see that philosophy is often not just difficult and painful, but can be downright fatal sometimes. Socrates was, of course, sentenced to death for practicing philosophy. According to Berlin, the reason why we, or some of us, engage in philosophy is precisely, again to quote, to reveal what is obscure in our categories, models, and concepts, to discern the conflicts between them that prevent the construction of more adequate ways of organizing and describing and explaining experience. End of quotation. So, Professor Daniels argues that the lessons of Plato's demonstration of philosophy are very much apt for many of today's issues, and in particular the set of ideas associated with cosmopolitanism. As he argues, cosmopolitanism has come to be accepted, at least within many Western academic and public circles of political thought, as truth. Cosmopolitanism, here understood as the view that liberal principles of justice and human rights apply globally, is considered to be an integral part, or perhaps bedrock, of contemporary political theory, with a universal commitment to egalitarianism and no metaphysical assumptions, or at least a non-metaphysical pragmatic attitude. In Professor von Daniels' words, cosmopolitanism itself is presented as a kind of logical consequence of political thinking. So we can take cosmopolitanism then to be one of the current dominant concepts or categories of models in terms of which we think. Professor von Daniels is careful to note that there were certainly elements of cosmopolitanism, despite the presumptions of some, in the ancient world, and particularly in the works of Isocrates and Xenophon, in which the belief that certain cultures, forms of government, and ideas were valuable and appropriate for all places, and that peace among peoples was both desirable and possible. Now, we might even be forgiven for supposing that Plato would have been among the forerunners of cosmopolitan thinking. How else could the originator of the Platonic theory of forms, including forms of natural, geometric, and social objects, including the ideal of form of a city, not be a cosmopolitan? But against this rather natural thought, Professor von Daniels invites us to suspend this intuition and instead pay attention to Plato's work, and especially his concern to show the errors of false reasoning, sophistry, especially unexamined assumptions. Here I think we can detect two sorts of arguments designed to show that Plato was perhaps not a cosmopolitan. So here's my attempt to try and summarize what I took to be two lines of argument in extremely rich paper. The first argument that I think we can find is that Plato expressed particular practical political views about cities, societies, and constitutions, which made room for recognition of meaningful differences and variations, such that universal principles of social living might be out of place. But more importantly, his view of the ideal closed city, with a strong warrior class whose job it was to purge the city of ills and defend it against external threats, acknowledges a non-cosmopolitan world where peace cannot be assumed. I think I'd add to this argument that also towards the end of the paper, Plato expresses a certain disregard for many faction segments of societies, especially those which he supposes are not ready or not capable of philosophical thinking, particularly when he refers to entire sections of populations as sheep, dogs, flocks who need to be shepherded, and so on. That's not the kind of cosmopolitan thinking that we would find in Isocrates and Xenophon, and certainly not in modern views, many modern views. Now, the second argument, designed to show that Plato was perhaps not a cosmopolitan, or at least was opposed to the cosmopolitan framework of the 4th century, is that his commitment to philosophy demanded that he and anyone with philosophical dispositions had to be appropriately detached from any prevailing dominant ideas or popular beliefs, whatever these might be, so that there was always room for critical appraisal. If I've understood Professor von Daniels correctly, in this sense, it's not so much the particular content of the ideas and beliefs that matter, but only their status as popular, perhaps unquestioned, which triggers philosophical scrutiny. Indeed, I think it's the second argument, which is perhaps the main argument to be drawn from his sustained account of philosophical practice. Now, however, one question seems natural to ask here, and I think it emerges, at least for me, from a puzzle I found in the following passage from Professor von Daniels' paper. So at page 33, he writes, to quote, "From Plato's point of view, all these aspects of Hellenic political life, in which we may recognize us in our own contemporary world, would be completely irrelevant as long as it lacked philosophy. It is for this reason that Plato does not find it necessary to explicitly refute cosmopolitan theories or engage in debates with democratic or cosmopolitan views, since no debates of this kind can ever be on equal terms, but at best will only serve as preliminary or educational discussions leading to the point of view of real insight." Or perhaps, if I'm not wrong, they might be preliminary discussions which then might need to be kicked away in an attempt to achieve an enlightened understanding or point of view of real insight. And the puzzle is that it's not clear how we would distinguish between, on the one hand, cosmopolitan views which lacked philosophical underpinnings and so wouldn't deserve or merit refutation or even rational analysis, I suppose. And on the other hand, a state of affairs in which cosmopolitan views are philosophical in the right way and so constitute part of the point of view of real insight. Now, in other words, I'm not sure how we could tell that a liberal cosmopolitan perspective is or isn't part of some kind of enlightened understanding. Now, Plato seems to make cosmopolitanism's aptness for philosophical examination somehow dependent upon its surrounding actual philosophical and historical context. So instead of taking up its merits, i.e. taking up the sophists perhaps, and instead simply silencing them, we seem to be left wanting a bit more by way of positive argument from Plato. Or at least, if not positive argument, more critical or negative argument concerning the cosmopolitan view. Now, the second question follows from this first. The paper begins by identifying several characteristics of cosmopolitanism and notes that there are or ought to be some reservations with its current status in contemporary political thought. There's also a promise that returning to Plato's time and work will help explain or put into broader context what the significance of these reservations or worries are. But here I'll admit that I had a hard time tracing the thread of argument. How exactly does the demonstration of philosophy found in Plato's work, so his commitment that philosophy's aim is to sort of extricate us from current ways of thinking and ask deeper questions, how does this come back to bear on the discussions of cosmopolitanisms which have the characteristics identified early on? I think this question is further complicated by the worry that the cosmopolitan views of the ancient world might be sufficiently different, since they're focused on peace, from contemporary views which take human rights and justice, i.e. not peace, as their focus. Here I'm thinking, and this might be the wrong example to draw on, but I'm thinking of some of the work of Alan Buchanan on the universality of human rights and how we ought to ground a moral account of international relations on the basis of an account of human rights and justice. But I'm worried, though, that I might not have the right example in mind of a contemporary cosmopolitan. So I'll bracket that particular question. As a final question or comment, I'm also left wondering just how much we might learn about the merits of cosmopolitanism from paying attention to Plato's silencing, i.e. not refuting, but silencing of the cosmopolitans in his own time. While views about cosmopolitanism that existed in the ancient world might be relatively unphilosophical or rest upon rather thin moral foundations, such as a hope or desire for peace, and so are perhaps beneath philosophical analysis, if Plato is right. Contemporary versions of cosmopolitanism seem much more philosophical, resting as they do on fairly well-developed accounts of human rights and justice. So it might then be strange to suppose that a similar strategy of overcoming or silencing would be appropriate for contemporary cosmopolitans. I'm not sure that was a view that you arrived at, but that was one question that emerged to me about whether Plato's strategy is one which would be appropriate in our time. So I guess if there's a theme to my questions, it's an invitation for further discussion about the lessons we can draw from Plato for contemporary debates surrounding cosmopolitanism.
Thank you. Do you want to reply, maybe?
Yeah, we usually have.
Yeah.
Yes, for the comments they were very nice. And, we'll try to just make 3 short comments. Maybe we can come back then in the discussion to the comments. So first of all, it's what I'm making here is in a way not a kind of complete argument. So I'm not trying to say like Strauss, all we have to do is simply read Plato and then we have got a new point. So what I mainly do is that I want to shatter something like the self-assurance of some forms of cosmopolitanism, where we know we just have to rely on liberalism, and this is the only philosophical tradition there is, and then we are getting to the point. And the way I'm doing is that I'm pointing out it could be possible to write a history of decay, which I'm not actually doing, but I could say the current stage of affairs is in a way the lowest point of philosophy we have reached. So we have come back to the sophists, we have come back to the pre-philosophical period. That's a kind of story one could also write. I'm not actually doing this, but I'm just showing that history of philosophy can be written in a variety of ways, either as a history of progress, as a history of how liberalism and human rights emerged and became universalized, or you can also write it in a different way. So that's in a way the only point I make to invite a certain kind of discussion, to invite a certain kind of historical discussion, and that then needs to take Plato and the ancients in a specific way seriously. The other second more maybe interesting point for the history of philosophy is that I include Plato at all in the cosmopolitan discussion. I show that unlike modern day people would presume that cosmopolitanism started only with Diogenes, that I show now it started indeed in a certain way with Plato, and he has a specific position. So there are certain reasons that on the one hand he seems to be very close to take something like a cosmopolitan position, but then ends up doing the very opposite. And there is even some form of a tension in Plato, where you see that at some point Socrates is presented in a cosmopolitan way, but he and that's strange. He never really goes to this point, and this is something which really needs explaining. So why is someone who is living in the 4th century, so he's seeing what's going on around him, so he knows that that he doesn't think that Athens is the new Rome. He knows that there must be something else happening. He knows that there are these federal states coming up. So things historical scholars have discovered in the last, or have focused on in the last 20 or 30 years. He knows that there are different sides coming up. He knows that he has been in Sicily trying to establish something. So he was very active in his time, and he knew his time called for something else. And for most of the time, when you look at textbooks in philosophy, they always wrote, Plato lived in a polis, he never thought about anything else than living in a polis. And this seems to be completely wrong. So so it's a different kind of picture you get than from Plato. So this is more a point on the history of ideas, where you see, okay, Plato could be someone who is in a way similar to this what we do nowadays. And the provocation is, and I admit it's so far it's only a provocation, is what would he say if we gave him something like one of the papers by Thomas Pogge, Step by Nietzsche in the 19th century? He would translate it into ancient Greece and give it to him to read. And so the provocation is that Plato would read it and say, okay, I don't have to change anything in the Politeia. because I have a different kind of conception. That's not the kind of philosophical conception. It's not really, not even real philosophy. And I admit this is a kind of provocation where you would say, you cannot say that Thomas Borger is not a philosopher. He's a very important philosopher nowadays. In a way to show how is it possible that someone could say something like this. So this is somehow the way I present Plato. Of course, you point out what does it mean to lack philosophy. Then we are suddenly in a strange way of discussion. Why could someone like Plato say that Thomas Borger is not a philosopher? This sounds outrageous nowadays, and for this reason, I'm not really in a way making this argument. I'm just in a way playing with these kind of ideas. The point would be you need to have some very systematic idea, including a metaphysical, something like a metaphysical basic, which is not a metaphysics. So, but you need to do all these kinds of things. Modern day political philosophers say they cannot do. They cannot discuss metaphysics, and they cannot discuss question about the good, and they do not really have the kind of systematic view. But all this, in a way, somehow needs to be done. And maybe just a final point to your last question. When you said, yeah, but we have somehow more rich theories we could offer. These are theories which are alluded to at the very end when I say what kind of principle is it based on. So if you would then come up with a principle of subjectivity and explain how the principle of subjectivity allows to reconstruct both metaphysics as well as some kind of political theory. So if you really go into in a way the full-scale Kantian theory, this of course would be something where Plato wouldn't say, okay, that's something sophistic. This of course would be an alternative, but it would require something like much more than just let's say a political reading of Kant. It would really require to take the whole Kant, so the whole metaphysics, including everything else. This would be a real alternative, where of course then Plato would also be interested in, or where you could see, okay, this is some way how you could answer this kind of challenge, which is then presented by Plato. So just to summarize, it's indeed only kind of challenge, provocation I make. I could write a history of decay, which I'm not really doing, just in a way to turn things around and to start discussing things in a different kind of context, which is in the end exactly what Plato did. So he lived in the 4th century, but he always wrote about the 5th century because he wanted to discuss things of the 4th century.
That's good. Follow-up to your debate. So I feel like one of the things that you're bringing out and that Mike was picking up on is that in some ways what Plato is telling the cosmopolitans is you guys don't have a theory. You just have intuitions. You just have nice feelings or something like that. But you don't actually have a philosophical theory. And maybe that's a criticism we could make of contemporary cosmopolitans as well, that sometimes they're a bit heavy on the intuitions, a bit light on the arguments, and so on and so forth. But one question is, does so-and-so have a theory? Another question is, what would be the right kind of theory for the kind of subject we're talking about? And I was wondering if you think that Plato remains a good guide for that, right? So it's probably a good lesson to draw from Plato that as philosophers, we should not just be seeking plausible conclusions, but we should be seeking a pair, which is plausible conclusions that are attached to a theory that allows us to understand them better and so on. But then there's the question, what would be a philosophical theory? And so in recent discussions, the person who's had the most influence on how we understand theories in this context is John Rawls, and he has a very different conception of what a political philosophical theory would look like than Plato. So I was wondering, do you think that there are lessons to be drawn from Plato about what a real theory looks like in political philosophy, or just about the need for a real theory, whatever that might be?
So another reason why I came into this kind of discussion was to try to think about what kind of alternatives are there to political theory, and how can you theorize or think about the alternatives. One way which I think is not very helpful is this, what I also then see in some kind of cosmopolitan debates, including once by Alan Buchanan. He then has some kind of hypothetical ideas. What could be, what we still call a reasonable political theory, and then he comes up with some kinds of idea. Maybe some people have collectivistic ideas, and we can still tolerate them, but only if they comply to this. Or maybe people are decent societies, and we can tolerate them, but only if they do this and this. But this always presumes that you are in a way on the big position, and you can tolerate the people who are not yet as educated, who are not as far. And you are in a way the one who really sets the term. And if you turn this around,
Plato doesn't have a problem with that, right? That's his whole thing.
No, Plato doesn't have a problem with this, but this turning around would be that. That Plato would say the Rawls, this is something which is more kind of sophistic thing, which is not even philosophy. So this is, of course, it's more. It sounds like a mere provocation, but first of all, the influence of Plato in the 20th century, or the way to understand Plato. So people sometimes think that. People like Popper invented the totalitarian reading of Plato, which isn't true. What Popper did is he simply reacted to the totalitarian reading of Plato, which was very prominent in the 1920s and 30s in Germany. So people indeed conceptualized their own life and their own societies in those terms, and it's then difficult to say this is not philosophy, or you are only a philosopher if you read Rawls. Then you, first of all, you have indeed two competing opinions. This is then, there are two footnotes in the paper where I refer to the so-called axial time. It's the point where I think it is getting interesting even for discussion which are leading beyond this, that it provides a way to conceptualize the other, where the other is not simply someone who's inferior, who's not as intelligent, who's not as educated or as liberal as you are, but where the other indeed is a kind of philosophical side on its own. So where you see, okay, the other one could be someone like Plato, and then it's much more difficult to say, oh, Plato is simply someone who's living only in a decent society. He's not yet liberal. So you really have to come to some form of understanding. And so and this process, like a discussion between Rawls and Plato, then would be something like a real discussion on equal terms, but not a discussion between Rawls and someone like who is presenting a theory of a decent society or a theory of a collectivistic morality, which wouldn't be a discussion on equal terms.
Thank you. So let's open. Anyone?
Okay. Thank you. I don't know how this works. Is this good enough for the microphone rule?
That's excellent.
Yeah. Thank you all for an interesting discussion. I guess I'm most interested in this idea of an uber cosmopolitanism, and like we seem to be moving in a or the conversation seems to be moving in a direction away from a specific sort of articulation of what such a theory would be. And my understanding of, is it something that only emerges through practice, or is part of the problem that there is this sort of like overly analytic approach to a lot of moral philosophy nowadays, which ultimately only ends up sort of patronizing alternative viewpoints and casting them aside. And I'm wondering, can you relate some particular contemporary debates over cosmopolitanism to to your critique of the liberal position? the way it's associated with cosmopolitanism. I'm particularly thinking of like the protests that are going on in the Middle East over this anti-Islam video right now, and if because I find that particular examples can sometimes help illustrate the sort of motivation that's behind some of these issues.
Maybe 2 points. So the first point about the Uber-cosmopolitanism, I use it to illustrate a kind of strategy of Plato, how he puts certain things into question. So it's one of the, one could say, one of the indeed funny answers Plato is giving implicitly to people who claim I've got something like universal idea of justice and universal principles of justice. So the principles of justice I just wrote down are the ones that need to be practiced throughout the whole universe. So really, whole cosmos, whole universe. And Plato's answer would be, oh, nice, but the universe isn't enough. You have to go beyond this universe and discover another universe, or also think that this universe could be a different kind of universe. And he's not really serious about this, because in a way, what should it mean going beyond the universe? And then he's introducing some kind of thought experiment in the allegory of the statement, where it goes that there are two kinds of or two ways the world can be run, either in the correct or in the wrong way. The correct way is under the guidance of the gods, and in this time, people are born old, and then they get younger during the course of the time. And of course, one of the good things is that people don't procreate at this time, because this is always, for Plato, very, very bad if men and women together. That's something Plato doesn't understand and doesn't want to have at all. And it's only our time, which is in a way the wrong time, the wrong course of the world, where people are born young and getting older and have all these kind of different problems. And what he points out is that there are different kinds of basic intuitions one can have. You either can have the basic intuition that people are good or peoples are good, and you just have to, just have to let them interact, and then something good is coming out. So this is the basic intuition in Rawls. For Rawls, there's nothing like evil peoples or peoples who are evil out of themselves. No, peoples are always good, especially if they are liberal peoples. Then they simply are good. And for Rawls, for Plato, he simply points out, okay, you can have either this very basic intuition and build a kind of theory, or you can have a very different kind of intuition, say that the whole mankind is basically doomed. Everything that's going on is going very bad. It's so far, this is only then, he shows these are two basic positions, and you have to go in either way, but he's opening a discourse in this way. So this means, in a way, Uber-cosmopolitanism. It's a funner answer saying to someone, I've got principles for the universe. Universe isn't enough. To your second point about how could it relate to things like protests in the Middle East, only indirectly. So I don't think that I could stop them. Maybe they would fall asleep when they hear me lecturing or things like this. But possibly there's an indirect way. This again has to do with trying to build up some kind of basis for common understanding. I think that is very helpful then in either going back to the ancient tradition or to different kinds of tradition of philosophy, because at this point people could talk to each other and have their various views on Plato's or on the ancients or religious traditions. So. To name just one example, so I know that there are scholars, especially in Iran, who are very interested in even people who are in the who are in religious schools, who are very interested in this kind of ancient tradition. For them, it's easy to accept as they know, okay, this is something which was before the formation of Islam, and somehow we had this integrated, and somehow it was in our culture. So this is possible at least to have a reasonable conversation about this with those people. And then you disagree about a reading of Plato, whereas it is, I assume, very difficult to have the same kind of conversation if you start right away with the notion of human rights and global justice, because this will end up in a confrontation. So there's no, you will not disagree about something, but you will indeed start some kind of implicit fight about something. So indeed, it would be indeed. You could imagine a scholar, even someone who seems to have very strange ideas, a conservative scholar who still is a very good scholar of Plato, and then you could start at least this process of understanding. So this is in a way how this could indeed turn out to, to be in a way beneficial.
Sorry, can I follow up? Is it fair to say then that you're sort of promoting an understanding of dialogue as a means to an inclusive anti-universalism?
Yes, maybe this would be indeed a good characterization. So that this is indeed trying to understand what's going on in such kind of a dialogue. It's always in a way easy to say. You just have to have a dialogue and respect the other, but it's very difficult to really conceptualize the other as someone who's completely different and who's nevertheless someone who has who is something like a philosophical side on its own. And this is something where, on the one hand, you can learn something about this in Plato, but on the other hand, you realize he himself has problems in a way conceptualizing the other in this kind of way. Because for him, there's all kind of dialogues are basically between a teacher and between a pupil. There's always someone who's higher and there's someone who is lower. So this is indeed a limit of, as I see it, of Plato's philosophy.
All right, I have some partially formed ideas of what you're trying to get across in this paper. So I want to try, I guess, to put some statements in your mouth and you can spit them out or chew on them as you see fit. I suppose the first of these is, it seems as though what you're saying is that what we take to be cosmopolitan philosophy now is in fact a cosmopolitan dogma, or we're not following through on Plato's conception of philosophy at any rate. So on certain understandings, what we're doing now isn't philosophy at all. And this is because we've lost sight of certain basic philosophical methodological principles, such as you don't take a claim to be true just in as much as it's popular, or you don't take it to be true unless you've reflected on it a sufficient amount of time, and that you're open to claims being true even though they're not supported by your own history or something along those lines. So bringing this back to what you said at the beginning about the two themes in cosmopolitanism, namely that they all take equality to be axiomatic, and they attribute a metaphysical view to non-egalitarian doctrines, and they claim to be anti-metaphysical and non-metaphysical. I wonder if this is exactly where they're defaulting on those basic methodological principles, namely by taking equality to be axiomatic. It's somewhat akin to taking a popular idea to be true, or to failing to properly reflect on the bases of our valuing equality. And on the other hand, we're just not recognizing that we are appealing to some controversial metaphysical view, where instead we're trying to transform metaphysics into some kind of bludgeoning tool we use to silence other views we don't like. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it's indeed a fair way of expressing this. So the one example I made is I have to I'm a bit unfair to talk about, but simply I have only a very short amount of time to treat him. But he's saying, if he's saying that the only kind of people who are anti-egalitarian are basically racists or Nazis or whatever, then yeah, Plato and Aristotle, they were obviously egalitarianism, and they did it in such a way that it's difficult to really realize where it really comes. So in Plato, in the Politeia, he develops a whole political theory, and the first time that he actually uses the word freedom and equality, and this is to be noted that freedom and equality were the most important political terms in Athens at his time. So it's not that he didn't know this. Everyone was talking about this. It's like nowadays. And the first time he mentioned this is in Book 8, and at the very end of the discussion of democracy, then Socrates says, oh, we nearly forgot to talk about freedom and equality. This is nearly funny, so you really have to read it as a kind of funny response. So he developed something which is completely new, which hasn't been there, and he somehow silences this whole debate on freedom and equality to show that philosophy can also be something else. And of course, you can read it nowadays in those terms. And so far, I'm just proposing in a way to start this kind of dialogue. So. Once again, I'm not in a way in the Straussian line that I say Plato is the truth and we just have to follow Plato. It's just to invite, indeed, as you said, there's a dialogue. We can also think in a different way, and that's something which could be beneficial for some reason.
So it sounds as though the trouble is that the cosmopolitans, they're taking freedom and equality as basic, and they're not seeing whether philosophy leads us to these ideas first. Instead, they're building their philosophy from these ideas as though they're given. I suppose the way to push back on this would be just to challenge this sense of cosmopolitanism as taking equality as basic. And maybe what's really going on here is that Plato wouldn't recognize the forms of arguments with which these cosmopolitans take equality as not an axiom, but as a premise, as they expand on their political views. So coming back to Rawls, the trouble here is, in a sense, that Rawls is replacing what you might take to be a metaphysical framework for building up these values of freedom and equality with his own constructivist framework. And on the one hand, it might be that he's taking these values as given in as much as they form the considered judgments of our liberal history. On the other hand, isn't it the case that he models them in such a way that we can take them to have a kind of philosophical validity, even if it's not a metaphysical validity?
If you live in a liberal society, then of course it serves as a way of self-understanding. But there are, in a way, but most people in the world, you could say, in a way, even everyone who's not American lives in a society that has different kinds of tradition. There has a liberal tradition and also some kind of, let's say, oligarchic or some kind of other tradition. So even the UK has the monarchical tradition, which is even seen in Quentin Skinner. He's appointed by royal warrant to his chair. And he's always writing about republicanism, but he gets in a way a royal warrant to appoint his chair. So this tradition is there as well. And somehow, if you want to make sense of what is happening, you need to conceptualize both traditions. And this is partly, of course, I'm speaking from the kind of German history. So it wouldn't be enough to say, okay, there has been the liberal tradition, and for some unhappy reason, we learned about this only very late. We learned about this only when in 1945 or so, which is then you cannot make sense out of your own tradition. You have to have something else, which is, by the way, very last thought. Very strange in Habermas. So when he reconstructs the political philosophy, he always omits, in a way, the National Socialist turnaround. So he, for instance, he starts with the story of Habermas always goes at the beginning. There was the distinction between system and the social world, and slowly the next step you have got some kind of constitution, and then you have social democracy, and then after social democracy you have some kind of realization of limits of social democracy because they don't respect the rights of women or so. But of course, in a way, between social democracy, which happened in Germany in the Weimar Republic, and the recognition of the women's rights, something else happened. And this is the point which is in Habermas always left over, because he likes to write this kind of history of success. And this is very strange. And so something's really missing in there.
Thanks.
questions? I have a sort of follow up to that. You suggested that the cosmopolitans of Plato's day were just taking equality as the starting point, and you say this was part of the political discourse, and it's strange that Plato doesn't mention it until Book 8 of the Republic and so on. But did they really have a conception of equality? Did anybody in Greece at that time have a conception, not just the idea of equality, but a conception of equality that we would recognize as remotely egalitarian? Or were they more like, we should be at peace with other Greeks, we shouldn't have war with Sparta or something like that, which, you know, that could be based on all sorts of views. But did they really have so for instance, did anybody have views about the equality of women? Were these widespread, the equality of non-Greeks, the equality and so on? I mean, I'm guessing these would be very marginal views back then, no?
So one of the problems of Greece or Greece theory is that it is strange that we don't have a treatise on democratic theory, but we have very highly developed democratic practices. And so we need to reconstruct, so to say, the political theory of the Greece from the criticisms that were raised against this practice. So the criticism either by the old oligarch, who's the most famous one, or other kind of criticisms. Then criticisms by Plato and Aristotle, which were in a way very late. But historians are pretty good in pointing out that they have very elaborate ideas about equal representation in government. So this is a government by lot, isokratia, which is a very important point. There are people like Antiphon who express the equality of men and women. There are some people who question slavery. Someone who draws this to the extreme is Popper. He always, what Popper is doing, he's reading the sophists, and all the sophists turn out to be critical rationalists avant the lettre. And at some point you realize, okay, it cannot be in a way that easy. But he has a certain point to show that that people indeed held those kind of at least some point, people held these views. And if you're in Aristophanes or in the comedies, you see the equality of men and women, and the speeches that are made are pretty good, good speeches about equality. It's only as it is comedies, these speeches about equality of men and women, every second sentence there's a kind of sexual allusion. So it's but it's artfully constructed into the Greek language. So you need to be you need to read really the classical scholars to show how they could, in a way, use in every second sentence some kind of sexual allusion. But in a way, taking the kind of sexual allusion away, at least they had the possibility to think about this. In the same way as they had the possibility to talk about building a federal state. So Xenophon says there was this argument made in not only in Athens but also in Sparta. So it was voted down, but people made this argument. He said that someone made this kind of suggestion. It would be good to form an alliance with all Greek states and even beyond, and then we would have peace. We wouldn't need the Persian king. And most people of Sparta said, "Oh, it's completely nonsense." But this doesn't. And of course, it didn't happen. What happened, in fact, was that people made these arguments. So they were there, and these were, I think, should be taken seriously as arguments and as conceptions of equality, as freedom, and somehow even of some form of federalism.
Anybody else? Well, we're almost at 4, so going once, going twice. All right, well, let's thank our speaker then.
Okay, thank you very much then for the discussion.